The Bring a Trailer Podcast.
Hello, everybody, and welcome back to the Bring a Trailer Podcast. Alex Porter here, Director of Auction Production, joined today by author Jay Gillotti. Jay, thanks for joining us.
Thank you, Alex. It's my pleasure.
We love to list Porsches and talk about Porsches at Bring a Trailer, and so we're excited to have you join today to talk about your newest book. You've written about Porsches a lot in your career, Jay, but today we're talking about Porsche Decades, a really beautiful and fantastic new book. It covers the history of the whole company. It's about 150 years. Is my math right there? You go all the way back to the birth of Dr. Porsche himself.
Yes, that's correct. Next, we're just about 1 year away from his 150th birthday, which will be on September 3rd next year.
Amazing. When you think about it like that, it's really one of the most incredible, car company stories that's out there. Is that what you were thinking about as you were conceiving of this book?
Yeah, that was part of it. The main thing really was my hope that my fellow Porsche Club members and Porsche owners would gain some new appreciation for the first 75 years of the history. In 2023, Porsche celebrated their 75th as a manufacturer of automobiles, but there's, of course, 75 years almost prior to that, which includes virtually all of Ferdinand Porsche's career. And I'm hoping that my readers and especially my fellow Porsche Club members will learn. I had to learn a lot in order to write it, and I'm hoping they will, learn a lot and also get to appreciate, this great engineer and designer who is responsible for starting the company.
Yeah, it's a really broad book, but you also get into a lot of details. There's a lot of great photos. I have a lot of questions for you about all of that, Jay, but You must have read a lot to research this.
Yeah, I mean, I either read or reread everything I could pretty much get my hands on in the course of 4 years doing the book. Because as I said, there is so much that I did not know, be it on the pre-World War II, never mind pre-World War I period. And a lot of the, last 75 years on the production car side, there's a lot that I either didn't know at all or had to refresh myself on. I know a little bit better the Porsche's motorsport history, particularly the past 50 or 60 years on that side. But I had to do a lot of reading and research. So
your other kind of book that is well known to Porsche folks and maybe even outside of the kind of Porsche community is about the 917, which is, I know, one of your passions. You're wearing an awesome, people can't see it, we're not on video, unfortunately, but you're wearing an awesome 917 t-shirt right now. How much of the research you did for that book helped play into this, or was that, since it's just kind of a small chunk of the whole history of the company, was that maybe not nearly the grounding you would need, but presumably it helped to some degree when you were conceiving of this book and writing it?
It helped more with the process of how to do a book, because once you've done a car book like that, it really informs, the next project in terms of how to do it better, how to be more efficient, all of those kind of things. The research, not so much, because, my first book is like a lot of Porsche books we see today, very narrow, extremely deep in terms of its scope. That book is about 16 individual cars, whereas the new book, I decided to be a little bit contrary, and I decided to go very broad, as you say, 150 years time span, but it's introductory. There's nothing in the new book that's in significant depth. It's meant to be introductory for the people who are either new to learning about the history, new to learning about the brand and their car, or maybe they've been around a while and think they know it, but want to get a good refresher.
Yeah, I've been around, my dad loved Porsches. I've been around Porsches my whole life. I love them. I own a couple of them. And yet it was very, I learned a lot. It was educational. It is certainly broad, but it really drills down into a lot of really interesting parts of the company's history that I never knew about. Doing the research for it, was there anything particularly surprising, or, something that kind of blew you away as you were doing the research, maybe particularly about the early history of the company, or pre-Porsche, even really pre-Porsche company?
There were many things that surprised me. It's hard to think of just one. without giving too much away, I'll say the Russia project from 1932 is the one that's probably the most, it's very little known. It's shocking to think what would have happened had Ferdinand Porsche accepted the offer from the Soviets to essentially become the chief designer of Russia. And I'll let people read more detail about that, but you can just, I think if he had accepted that, I don't think we'd be here. I don't think we'd be talking about, I don't think we'd be having this conversation. I don't think anybody would, except the really in-depth automotive historians probably wouldn't even know who Dr. Porsche was.
Yeah, I found that fascinating as well. And definitely don't want to give any, we want people to go read the book because it's a great book. It's also a beautiful book, which I'd like to talk to you about. But some really great stories along those lines. Did you encounter any surprising documents or uncover anything that hadn't been noticed by anybody else before?
Very few, because that was not the intent of this project. Really, I wasn't intending to uncover much that's new. It was more about summarizing and packaging the existing information for a new audience, I hope, or an audience who's looking for a refresher. I did find a few things, few photos, that will not have been seen before or will only have been seen by the experts. So there's a few things like that sprinkled in there just to spice it up a bit. But in general, I purposefully tried to keep it, again, introductory. And I did not, Porsche Archive, first I must give great thanks to Porsche and Porsche's Archive, because without their support, we could not do this book. We certainly couldn't do it economically. And I purposefully did not pester Porsche's Archive to give me things that people hadn't seen before, although they did give me one or two photos that I certainly hadn't seen before, and I don't think have been published in any other book. But for the most part, I wanted to go with the photos that the experts will have seen a lot. But again, my audience will not have seen, and that was really the objective.
Did you go to the Porsche Archives? Did you go over to Stuttgart?
No, I did not. I still have not made the pilgrimage. I do intend to do that at some point, but I managed to do both of my books so far, just working remotely with the fantastic team there at the archive.
Man, that's changed. I was a history grad student many moons ago, and you still kind of occasionally had to travel to a dank, dusty archive. I bet the Porsche archives are not dank and dusty, but
no, not.
It's really, really changed.
Yeah, that might be something I will have to do for a future project, but we'll talk about that when it happens.
Okay, great. I want to end with where you're going next, Jay, but we'll come to that at the end. You mentioned what you really were thinking about was packaging this right, making the information kind of easily digestible either to new readers, people who are curious about Porsche, or folks who know something about it. I think I'd put myself in this category, but maybe haven't thought about the whole holistic story behind the family and where everything comes from, and also who maybe could use a little bit of a refresher or a tune-up. And I found packaging it by decades to be very useful, a really smart framing device. What were either the challenges of covering so much ground and thinking about how to package things, or maybe even just how you landed on that idea? I presume it wasn't your original idea, or maybe it was.
Actually, it was. I'm a person that I think sequentially, and I just think that way chronologically. So it's natural for me to want to organize the material that way. I wrote it sequentially. So in other words, I had pretty much a complete first draft of chapter 1 before I went on to chapter 2. I kind of liked the numerology of how we have just the way it worked out, where chapter 1 covers from 1875 to the end of World War I. And then we have the numerology of chapter 2 is the 20s, chapter 3 is the 30s, 4 is the 40s, and so on. I kind of like, the way that worked out. There's also significant events in Porsche history that happened kind of at the turn of the decade. And for instance, probably the most obvious one being 1930, when Ferdinand Porsche decides to start his own company. But there's other examples. 1950, they moved back from Austria to Stuttgart and start building cars in Stuttgart. 1970, they win Le Mans for the first time overall. So I just kind of felt like the decades, broke out neatly. And then people can also gravitate, you can go and read your favorite decade first, and then you can work backwards, work forwards, however you want to do that. The main challenge for me was just the agony of what to leave out, because it's such a rich and interesting history. And I just really had to work hard to figure out, oh God, how much can I fit into this book so as to interest the reader, but not overwhelm the reader with detail. And so hopefully we've done a reasonable job at that. And then, of course, I cheated by, using sidebars, which I love, and also our Porsche points, which are like mini sidebars, which gets even more little bits of arcane and interesting detail into the book, so that I didn't feel like I, had to leave some of the juicy stuff out. So I tried to, in the end, have my cake and eat it too a little bit. But I'm hoping that people will then branch out further after reading this book and then dive into this massive Porsche library.
Sure. I find the little sidebars very compelling too. The Russia Project is one of those. And I really like those. And as I've been flipping back through the book over the last week or two, those are the things I kind of land on. I don't mean to insult the book and say it's a coffee table book, but because it's not, it's a lot more deep than that, but it works very nicely that way. I've had it on my coffee table and I keep picking it up and reading it again. And you have a lot of nice little bite-sized nuggets in there that make it really fun to have that way too. And it's also aesthetically pleasing.
Thank you for saying that. And I don't mind if people have it on their coffee table, but I'm really, really hoping people will read this book. I know some people will just look at the pictures and maybe read the sidebars or whatever, but I'm hoping they'll just read it one chapter at a time, one sub chapter at a time, and kind of absorb it. I really think that understanding the history helps you to enjoy your car more if you're a Porsche owner, and certainly to enjoy the experience more of being a Porsche owner and being a Porsche club member. I think that's really because those of us who have been around it a long time, we speak a lingo and a language that's unique to Porsche. No different than the, Ferrari people and BMW and Mercedes and all the other brands. They have their lingo and their traditions and their own history. And the better you know that, the better you can join the conversation. So I'm hoping to help people join the conversation no matter where that conversation happens.
Yeah, really well said. I think about that a lot when we're kind of crafting Porsche listings on Bring a Trailer. It's like, man, do we want to speak to Porsche aficionados and use kind of the lingo? Like we use ROW in the title of some of our listings, right? Which is rest of world. And it means a different car than a US car. And sometimes people ask what that is. I'm often torn between using the lingo to show that we know what we're talking about and, speaking to, Porsches are very appealing to a broad swath of people. And there's a lot of folks coming into the Porsche community all the time. And you also want to explain things simply.
Right. And I recall one of your recent podcasts, I think it was Randy, who talked about how Bring a Trailer is actually attracting new people to the hobby, people who may or may not really be car people, but they've become attracted to just the excitement of the online auction, the community of the online auction, and therefore the community of people who are interested in cars, collector cars, whatever. And so again, I thought, okay, yeah, that's interesting. And I'm hoping maybe that my book will do something similar in terms of helping broaden the community and help people who want to join the community, not feel excluded and be able to, I keep saying it, but join the conversation. When we all start talking those 3-digit numbers, we know what we're talking about when we start throwing around those 3-digit numbers in Porsche world. But so many people do not know what we're talking about and quickly can get lost. So trying to provide a resource that will help them not only learn, okay, what is a 964, but if there's a picture of one right next to the few paragraphs where I talk about what a 964 is, you start to associate the number and get a picture in your head of, well, what is that?
Totally. Is it a 911 or is it a 964? Is it a 993 or a 911?
Of course, it's both, but that's what people have to get familiar with. And I think they'll find that really helpful.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I appreciate you framing the book that way because I'm always very sensitive to and very interested in wanting to both be able to speak to experts, and I really like wonky terminology, but also we want this hobby to be as welcoming as possible, right? Like that's part of it. And of course, Porsches are the gateway drugs for a lot of folks coming into the car world.
Yeah, well, I hope you're right about that. And by the way, I like other cars too. I'm not just a Porsche guy, but Porsche is sort of where at least professionally, where my heart is and where I feel most, interested in contributing to on a professional basis. And I think Porsche's kind of in that middle space between being extremely limited production mark like Ferrari or Lamborghini or somebody like that, and being, a true mass market car. Porsche's kind of in the middle somewhere, such that more people probably have experienced Porsche in their everyday life, or they see Porsches more often, riding around their local town. To your point, yeah, maybe that's where people get started with their interest, and we can help them out.
Absolutely. I'm like anxious to dive into your background, Jay, because you have an interesting background. But before we move away from the book, just a couple other quickies for you.
Sure.
We mentioned the photos a couple times. They're gorgeous in this. I have a 912E in Shamrock Green. You've got one on the cover, which I
oh my gosh. I can't believe it.
That sailplane picture when they were launching that car, you've got that in there too. I've always loved that publicity shot.
Oh, I love that picture.
Yeah, it's one of my favorites. And you don't see many of them in that green color. So I loved seeing that. But the pictures in general are gorgeous. And I really appreciate you saying that, talking to somebody who's just learning about Porsches and having, a visual reference right there next to what you're talking about is so important. And it also makes the book kind of evergreen. You can revisit it and look at all the gorgeous imagery in there. Were you thinking about that as an integral component the whole time when you were putting it together? Did you select photos later? How did that all happen as you were working on this project?
I certainly had a good idea of what photos I wanted as I was writing it, because many of these photos, even though they're Porsche archive photos, they have found their way out onto the internet, a lot of them. So you can just sort of say, oh, well, let's target this photo or that photo to go with this paragraph or that paragraph. And I have to give great credit to my friend and designer, Jody Ellis, who did the design and layout for this book. And she also did my first book and many of the other books that are published by Dalton Watson, my publisher. Jody and I work very well together. We have a really good system for me to indicate in the manuscript where I think photos belong. And then she just does a great job of taking what I've given her and just making it flow. We always talk about the flow, and we try to get the flow really good. And so she's really good at it. She listens to my crackpot ideas and tries to integrate them as best she can. And, she'll rein me in if I get too crazy with, the visual side of things. She didn't kill my idea of having the colors change, the design colors change with each decade, so that was one of my crackpot ideas that survived the process. But yeah, we think really hard about photo placement, and I try to do it again. And after having done one book, you do the second one, and as you're writing the first draft, you just have learned how to avoid a lot of the mistakes you might have made on the first book.
Sure. Did revisiting all the 917 history feel like a rehash, or was that enjoyable as you went back through it for a second time? I mean, it must have come fairly easily, right?
Yeah, well, but again, the challenge for me is, okay, how do I shrink it down to a certain number of paragraphs? When I wrote a whole book about this car, and now I've got, X number of paragraphs to work with. It's got to be in proportion with all the other cars I'm writing about. Like most of the other sections, it was challenging, but I like a challenge. So we worked it out. I probably gave the 917 a tiny bit more ink than maybe I did some other cars. So, there's a little bias there, but, it's hard to, and the 917 is I don't like the word iconic for a variety of reasons, but it probably applies pretty well to the 917. So
sure, especially
we'll
a Gulf 917. No one's going to complain, Jay. That's the icon. I think that's fair enough.
Yeah.
Did a particular decade kind of grow on you? Was there a certain section that you either enjoyed doing a lot as you were going through it, or that maybe grew on you in a way that you didn't love it before?
I would say probably the one that comes to mind is the 50s, because The 50s I hadn't really looked at very much in the past, so I had a lot of learning to do there. I'm ashamed to say I'd never even sat in a 356 until I did this book.
Jay, come on, man.
I know. Now, I did, in fairness, I did drive Volkswagens all through high school and college, like so many of us of a certain age did. And I found the 356 when I finally did sit in one and go for a ride in one. I found it very familiar territory and I loved it. But yeah, there was a lot of learning to do. And I really appreciate how the 50s basically set the stage for everything that comes after it in terms of Porsche's approach to design, their approach to competition, and advertising, or the lack of advertising. In other words, letting competition success be the advertising. Ferry Porsche's incremental approach to development and improving the cars. It's like one brick on top of the other. And now that, they've essentially been doing that for now 75 plus years. Mm-hmm. So yeah, I'd say the 50s were one where it was a lot of new territory for me, and I just really enjoyed it.
I love that era too. I'm going to butcher the competition director's name, and I've always wanted to know how to properly pronounce it. How do you say von Honstein's name? Huck von Honstein? I've never known how to say it. Husky? I don't even know how to say it.
Oh, Huschka.
Huschka. Okay.
Most of the people that I've heard say the name, people who knew him or knew of him, say Huschka von Honstein.
Okay. Love him as a character. Love that era, and I've never been able to say that name correctly.
Yeah, he's a fascinating character, particularly because Ferry Porsche was not one to court the spotlight. And so Huschka von Honstein was great at that. He loved the spotlight. He loved doing both press relations, which he was responsible for, and advertising, and at the same time also being the racing manager and being the guy out there at the tracks and lobbying the FIA or whatever it took. He was happy to be in the spotlight, and he was good at it from what I can tell.
A very nappy dresser. He looks great in photos.
Yeah. Yep. And he's somewhat of a controversial character now with historical perspective because of his membership in the SS. And that's a whole other topic that I do touch on briefly with not only Huschka, but some of the other Porsche employees. And that's part of Porsche history that we can't gloss over. Yep. We have to confront it because it's there. It's reality. But in the post-war period and the Porsche period, he was quite a fascinating character.
Agree completely. So we're talking about the 50s, and you go all the way up to the 2020s. And one of the things that, I'm not going to log roll too much for Bring a Trailer. We're here to talk about your book, but you do talk a little bit about collectability and kind of where Porsche has landed as this. You don't like the word iconic, and I overuse it. So this incredibly well-regarded and famous brand that is very aspirational. And, for a long time, I'm 41 years old. It was kind of people who were into motorsports who liked Porsches, and they were relatively small production. But now it is a kind of a different beast. And of course, the collectability of Porsches is a big part of the legacy. And we're obviously a big part of that. I was telling you before we started recording, we've had over 21,000 Porsche listings on Bring a Trailer. Not all of those are cars. We sell wheels and engines. And we reunited a 906 owner's manual with that chassis number. All kinds of interesting stuff, but mainly it's cars. And so I would love for you to kind of talk about how you think about that and what your thinking was in terms of incorporating that into the book, particular kind of maybe in the 21st century where that's really skyrocketed.
Yeah, again, I think I don't address collectability too much, except in the afterward section. I did put my 2 cents in there about what I think people can do in terms of especially buying the car that's going to fit with how you're going to use it. To me, that's the most important thing, not just with Porsche, but any collectible car. You've got to have the car that fits with how you want to use it. So if you want a car that you can drive all the time and that you can, do long driving tours and whatever, you may not want to chase the number one condition car, the one that's so perfect that you're going to be afraid to get a single rock chip. That's my piece on that is, you've got to find the car that meets your needs. if you want to do a lot of driving tours, and is an air-cooled Porsche where the radio maybe doesn't work and the air conditioning never worked, and all of that, is that the right car for how you're going to use it? So these are all the things I think people should look at. The other thing I tried to do, again, was just from a perspective point of view and an introductory point of view, help people understand this evolution, not only of the sports cars particularly, but as well as also the four-door cars, because they're important. But on the sports car side, I try to make sure that there's a basic guide for understanding the evolution, 996 to 997. And then a little further down in the weeds, 997.1 to 997.2, which is a huge, in my opinion, huge distinction.
No more IMS, Jay. You don't have to worry about that IMS anymore.
Yeah, and the introduction of the PDK is another big thing in the 997.2. And of course, that's all reflected in the values, as you guys see practically on a daily basis. So I try to give people a little background that can get them started. If they're thinking, well, I don't want an air-cooled 911. I think I want a more modern 911, but I'm not really sure, 996, 997, 991. They can get a good overview, I think, from my book, and then they can drill down further, as they should, with other resources and with hopefully some people who have real expertise that can help guide the search process.
Sure. And a lot of good, I know you're a longtime PCA guy, a lot of good resources in PCA for some of those things. In fact,
thank you for saying that. That's one of the big reasons, in my opinion, to join the Porsche Club is you get people who are not afraid to share their experience and their opinion, and also a lot of people with tremendous amount of expertise and, again, hands-on experience. If you're thinking of, say, a 944 Turbo, I know I've got people here in the Pacific Northwest region where I'm based who have thousands and thousands of miles of driving experience in 944 turbos, and you can benefit from all that experience.
Freaking love those cars. I had one for a little while when they were cheaper, and it was a ratty one. So maybe not the best one, but they're great.
Yeah.
I used a PCA reference. My Porsche I bought most recently is a 996 GT3, and PCA has a wonderful video on YouTube about those cars that was a really helpful resource.
Yeah, that's good.
It's interesting, too, how that car does start. It's 20 years old now. So does start to feel a little vintage. It feels in some ways closer to a 993 than it does to the modern Porsches. It's interesting, even though it's water cooled.
Yeah, well, all Porsches go through this cycle of collectability. There's virtually always, especially again on the sports car side, the four doors are a little different, but on the sports car side, virtually all of them go through, with the exception of the 993, which was never really out of favor in my view. But virtually all of them go through a depreciation curve and reach a point where they're maybe a little bit out of favor, and they kind of hit a floor in terms of their value. And then slowly but surely they take on a classic aura, a classic position in the market. And I mean, I've seen a few 996s, which I'll admit I was not necessarily a huge fan of when it first came out, but I've seen some early 996s in the right color lately. And I think, wow, that's really cool.
Mm-hmm.
I could see that in my garage. So totally. That's how it goes with Porsche.
Yeah, I think this is true of a lot of collector cars. For me, it's nostalgia to some degree. I was in the late 90s, early 2000s, again, to your decades point. That's when the kind of transition is happening into water cooled, and people were upset about it. But I was a teenager, and so 996 really appealed to me because that was the 911 of my youth, right?
Yeah.
And I know they've been a little out of favor. And I also, of course, have the narrow body impact bumper car with a 912E, another one that was out of favor for a long time. But man, the 911s of that era are really roaring back now, the mid-year 70s cars.
Sure. And because most of them have been refreshed and restored and or re-engineered to fix the foibles and troubles that gave them the bad reputation in the first place. So that's another thing that I try to mention, again, very briefly. When we talk about those mid-year 911s or the 911 SC, and I briefly mention a couple of the foibles that go with those cars. But virtually all of them have been fixed by now. When I've asked a couple of our local experts lately, when's the last time you saw a mid-year 911 that still had its thermal reactors? And the answer is, nobody can remember the last time they saw one.
Yep.
So,
man, they're heavy too. I took them off my 912E. They weigh a lot. That's the wrong place to have all that weight.
Yeah, a few people save them and they'll, save them as part of the provenance of the car, and you see pictures of them every once in a while. But yeah, it's pretty rare.
Yeah, for sure. One last question I just want to ask you. The introduction to your book is by Miles Collier, a name that will be familiar to many people.
Yes.
How did that come about? How did you come about getting him to write the intro?
Well, I've been an admirer of his for many years, read his book, which is great, heard him speak, and I think he speaks to the world of the collector car as well as anybody. I mean, he's articulate and knowledgeable. Also, his collection is, I think, almost half Porsche. So he's a Porsche guy through and through, knows the history. And I met him in 2021 at Pebble Beach when we did the 917 class to celebrate the 50th. And then last year at Rensport, I just briefly mentioned to him what I was doing with this project, and he said, yeah, send me something when it's done. And so when we were getting close to finishing the book, we sent it to him, and he looked at it and agreed to do the preface, and really appreciate his perspective.
Absolutely. Always love hearing from him, and his perspective, to your point, is always super interesting. So Congratulations on that. If you don't mind, I'd love to talk about you for a couple of minutes, Jay,
Sure.
here at the end. Let's talk about you, the person behind the book. How did you get into cars, and was it always Porsches, or were there other things that got you interested?
Yeah, well, it's, like so many of us, it goes back to my father. He worked in a Volkswagen Audi dealership from the time I was about 2 years old until I was, I think, 19 or 20 years old. So really all my formative years, I grew up around the dealership. And I actually worked for him in the dealership, of course, when I was in high school, washing cars. And there's always been this close relationship between Volkswagen and Porsche, and we talk a lot about that in Porsche Decades. So Porsche's in the environment. And then, of course, we have that Steve McQueen guy who caused all the trouble for those of us who grew up in the 70s.
Especially if you're a 917 guy, huh?
Well, that's how I became a 917 guy, because I saw the movie when the first time it was shown on television, which we think was in 1973. So I would have been about 9 years old when I first saw it. And that was pretty much the end, because seeing that movie at an impressionable age, that pretty much set me on a path. And then around 1990, early 1990s, I realized I was not going to be one of those guys who could be the expert on every car. So I said, well, what if I focus on one that I really like? So obviously picked the 917 and just tried to collect every scrap of information, learn as much as I could about that particular car. And that helped when I sat down to write the first book. Obviously, I had assembled a pretty good library and had a lot of the story and a lot of the information in my head. But being of Italian heritage, I also, when I was in, say, high school, college, those years, we kind of had the best of both worlds, because we could root for Porsche in sports car racing, and we could root for Ferrari in Formula One. So that's kind of, what I did during that period when I was really followed motorsport closely. And then, I've just carried on. And when I retired from the corporate world, I decided to write the first book just to kind of see if I could even do it. And it turned out pretty well. And we've got a lot of good compliments on it. And so just decided to carry on from there.
Yeah, it's certainly got a little bit of a legacy in it. I hear people talk about it from time to time. Was writing always part of the plan? Was that something you were interested in doing, or how did that come about?
Yeah, I've always been a good writer. I had tremendously good English teachers. Really, and when I look back at it, all the way from grade 7 to 12, I had excellent English teachers. I got 5 out of 5 on the advanced placement test in English. So I got, 6 college credits for 3 hours work taking the placement tests. And when I joined the Porsche Club, I started writing for our local magazine, The Spiel. And I think I wrote about 50 articles for The Spiel before I ever had my first article published in the Panorama, which is the national magazine for PCA. And before I started writing the first book, I had written those sort of 50 articles in the Panorama. And that was great preparation because you make a lot of your mistakes and you do a lot of learning in that process.
Both your interests and your writing primarily been motorsports focused, or street cars, both, a mix? What kind of, I guess mainly I would ask, where do your primary interests lie?
Yeah, it's been more motorsport than street cars, just because I gravitate to Porsche's history in motorsport for a whole variety of reasons.
For Porsche, it's kind of mixed up anyway, right? Like, they're a great company for explaining to people the tie between street cars and motorsports.
Yeah, it's very close. And Porsche has been pretty dedicated to using competition as R&D and developing technology that eventually, slowly but surely in some cases, finds its way into the street cars. I remember when I was in college and I was following motorsport very closely, and Porsche was trying this weird idea of this thing called the PDK in their 956, 962. And it was like, what's that all about? Yeah. And it's amazing and they actually did, I think they won at least one race that I know of with the PDK. And of course, I found out years later from the drivers that they hated it. But if you look at it, it took 35 years? Am I doing the math? Or is it 25? No, 25 years from that point to the point that the PDK finally finds its way into a 911. So, yeah, that's the kind of thing that I really enjoy following in the Porsche story.
Of course. Amazing that you were able to cover so much ground in this book, and also, that the story is so gigantic, it must have been a struggle you've alluded to this a couple of times, to boil it all down, but you've done a really nice job. And all I can say is really congratulations, because it's
thank you for saying that. And I also write music.
I read about that.
So that's another form of writing, but they do kind of help each other and they inform each other, because the process is somewhat similar. And just like in the book where we're looking for that flow, it's kind of the same thing in music. We're looking for a flow. And so, the two are, there's some linkage between the two of those, and the process of recording music and creating a car book are very, very similar. It's really interesting to me how similar they are. And I'm actually going to probably do a presentation on that at America's Car Museum here in a couple months. So that could be fun.
Awesome. Activating the same parts of the brain, eh?
Yeah. And the skills, there's similar skill sets involved, and also similar in terms of how you collaborate with other people, because the car book takes collaboration with publisher, designer, your sources, your people who provide photography, so there's a lot of collaboration that goes into doing a car book, and music is much the same way.
Well, it's been a pleasure having you, Jay. What's next? What did we not touch on? What are the parting shots? What else do you want to share with our audience?
Oh my gosh, I think we did a pretty good job covering it. So there's not too much else. I have an idea for another book, but I'm not really ready to talk about that yet. I hope to continue working with Panorama Magazine. Really enjoy working with the team there. And as we have decent ideas for articles, hopefully we'll do some more of those. And I'll do articles for other magazines, but only if I think I have a really good idea. I don't want to do them just for the sake of doing them. And then we'll see what else comes up in the future. And we'll keep an eye on Porsche and Porsche Decades. It could be, as you said, an evergreen book. If it does well, we can always add on to the end of it. We could release future editions of it with more information as time goes on. So we'll keep an eye on that. We'll see how it does and go from there.
Awesome. Well, congratulations, Jay. Again, Porsche Decades is a fantastic book. I hope folks will check it out. I like to end every podcast with a guest by asking them what the last great thing they drove was. What was the last car, Porsche or otherwise, that you were excited to get behind the wheel of? You mentioned 356s being a pretty awesome thing.
Yes, I don't get to drive very many cars other than my own. In fact, I'm a little gun shy on that. Even when I'm doing an article on other people's cars, I typically don't drive them. So I would say the last great car I drove is, just the other night, I drove my own 1985 3.2 Carrera, which is a car that I bought on eBay, by the way, in 2001, when that was a crazy thing to do before the existence of Bring a Trailer, unfortunately. That's back when eBay was a real auction site. And I just love that car. It's become part of the family. And every time I drive it, I just enjoy the heck out of it. So, yeah, I think that's the last great car that I drove.
I love those cars. I'm kind of a partisan for those cars. The 3.2 Carrera is such a good mix of vintage feel, but modern usability. I just love those cars.
Yeah, it's at the end of I look at it as being at the end of like a 20-year development cycle. So Porsche had worked a lot of the bugs out of it and had, developed the car, developed the platform about as far as it could go. And, so they're pretty reliable. I think they're built like tanks.
Yep.
And, of course, it's an old car now. So it's, you have to deal with cars almost 40 years old. And you have to deal with that. But I still drive it at the track once every so often. Often I'm the only air-cooled car on the track. But it's fun. I like the slow car fast idea.
Sure.
So 3.2 Carrera is kind of good for the slow car fast. And I kind of like that. So I'll be sticking with that one. And yeah, I don't think it'll be for sale anytime soon.
Fantastic. That's a great all-around Porsche. You bought it at the right time. They're a little more expensive than they were 20-something years ago.
Yeah, I bought mine in 2001. So it's getting to be a long time ago that I bought it.
Well, thanks for joining us again, Jay, and congrats again. A really wonderful book and an impressive feat by you and your team.
Thanks. And I should just mention, if I can, DaltonWatson.com is the website where people can get the book directly from the publisher. And you can also see our sample pages and all the other information and reviews about the book.
Very important to mention. Appreciate you saying that at the end. Thanks again, Jay. And thanks to all of you for listening. You can please send us any feedback, thoughts, criticisms, concerns. I want to hear it all to podcast@bringatrailer.com. Thank you all for listening, and we will catch you next time.